The Noran captain's blood turned icy as the human warship emerged from warp, its sleek predatory hull brimming with gun turrets and missile tubes. This was no mere patrol frigate. It was a Yorktown-class Heavy Cruiser designed to crush the Noran raiders who had been terrorizing human colonies aboard the UES Dauntless. Lieutenant Connor Mitchell woke abruptly to blaring alarms and flashing red emergency lights in the crew quarters. He hastily donned his uniform and rushed to the CIC, where Captain Hayes stood grimly at the hollow table, addressing her officers. "Listen up, people. A Noran raiding party hit the colony on Epsilon Ceti 3. They've taken hostages and fortified their position. We're the closest ship, so Fleet Command has tasked us with responding at maximum warp to secure the colonists' release or evacuation. I don't need to tell you what's at stake here. Those colonists are counting on us." Connor felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning in his gut. The Norscans were brutal reptilian species, striking hard and fast before vanishing back into the void. Starfleet had struggled to retaliate until now. As the crew rushed to battle stations, Connor's friend Brian elbowed him, commenting on the significance of the new Yorktown-class ships. Connor nodded, focusing on running diagnostics on the cruiser's weaponry. The Dauntless was built for this moment, to be humanity's iron fist against hostile races. Connor imagined the terrified colonists praying for rescue, determined that they wouldn't meet a fate worse than death in the Noran slave holds. With resolve, he and Brian geared up in the armory, ready to face the hostage situation head-on. In the CIC, Captain Hayes studied the tactical display while Commodore Kobe's sneering face appeared on screen, delivering a chilling ultimatum. He threatened to detonate plasma bombs among the hostages if any ships approached within 1 light minute of the colony. Hayes refused to negotiate, asserting Starfleet's stance against terrorists and butchers. "Commodore, if you harm those hostages, there will be nowhere in this galaxy you can hide from us," Janus snarled, his face contorting with rage. "It is you who should hide, human. I will splatter your precious colonists' blood across the stars, and that of your crew next." The transmission abruptly cut out. Hayes took a deep breath and turned to her officers. "Battle stations, people, and get me a line to Lieutenant Mitchell. I have a feeling we're going to need his Marines for this." As Connor and Brian finished gearing up, the tactical net in their HUDs flashed with an urgent message from the captain. It was terse and to the point. Hostages in danger, plasma bombs in play, covert extraction needed. Connor frowned as he processed the information, but he knew what had to be done. "Change of plans, buddy," he said to Brian. "Looks like we're going to have to do this quietly and carefully. Let's get the rest of the strike team and come up with an insertion plan." As the Dauntless dropped out of warp on the outskirts of the Epsilon Ceti system, the long-range sensors screamed a warning. 8 Noran knife fighters were already in orbit around the colony, and the sensors had picked up a fresh warp rift forming in the outer system, with more hostiles pouring out to reinforce their brethren. "Aerospace wings, you are clear to launch," Hayes barked into the ship-wide comms. "Neutralize those new arrivals before they can link up with the ones at the colony. Buy our strike team time to get those colonists out of there." Connor watched on the monitors as the Dauntless fighter wings streaked out of the hangar bays, the wedge-shaped Scimitar aerospace superiority craft looking like birds of prey as they clawed for altitude. They'd get the job done, he was sure of it. Now he just had to do the same. Connor's strike team silently boarded the M-Black assault shuttle, the small craft's cloaking field shimmering to life as it slipped out of the Dauntless hangar bay. In the cockpit, Corporal Jenichin deftly guided the shuttle through the chaos of the orbital battle raging around the colony, the nimble ship ducking and weaving to avoid stray plasma blasts. "Sensors are picking up the hostages, sir," Jenna reported, her voice calm and professional despite the dire situation. "Looks like the Noran have them corralled in the central plaza. I count a dozen tango on guard duty." Connor nodded, studying the tactical feed on his HUD. "Roger that. Take us in quiet and drop us on the rooftop overlooking the plaza. We'll cloak up and move in for the extraction." The shuttle ghosted over the colony's buildings, its muffled engines barely a whisper. It flared its landing thrusters at the last moment, touching down on a rooftop with cat-like grace. Connor and his Marines quickly disembarked, their armor's active camouflage engaging as they crept to the edge of the roof below them. The hostages cowered in terror as the Noran guards paced back and forth, their reptilian eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Connor signaled his team to spread out and take up positions to cover the plaza from all angles. Suddenly, one of the Noran sentries whirled around, his plasma rifle aiming directly at Private Brian Sorensen's position. The alien unleashed a searing blue bolt of energy that slammed into Brian's armor, the advanced composite plating absorbing the worst of the blast. However, the damage was done. Their cover was compromised. "Contact! Open fire!" Connor barked into the comms, his own rifle snapping up to draw a bead on the nearest Noran. The plaza erupted into a maelstrom of gas rounds and plasma fire as the two sides engaged in a vicious close-quarters battle. The Marines' superior weaponry and armor gave them a decisive edge, and one by one, the Noran guards fell under the withering hail of fire. But not before they managed to gun down several helpless hostages in a final act of spiteful cruelty. As the last shots died away, Connor and his team rushed to secure the remaining colonists, checking them for injuries and radioing for immediate medevac. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through a nearby building, the shockwave knocking several Marines off their feet. The Norcans had detonated one of their plasma bombs as a final insult to their human adversaries. Connor keyed his comms, his voice grim. "Captain Hayes, this is Lieutenant Mitchell. We've secured the hostages, but the Noran set off one of their bombs. We've got multiple casualties and need immediate extraction." Hayes's voice crackled over the net, tinged with static from the ongoing space battle. "Acknowledged, Lieutenant. Our fighters have neutralized the enemy ships that came through the warp rift, but we're still heavily engaged with the ones in orbit. I'm bringing the Dauntless in to assist, but you should expect heavy enemy reinforcements to hit the colony soon. Dig in and hold the line until we can get you out of there." Hayes out. Connor turned to his strike team, his expression hardening behind his visor. They all knew what those incoming Noran reinforcements meant. A bloody, desperate battle to keep the remaining colonists alive long enough for extraction. But they were Marines. This is what they trained for. "You heard the captain. Let's get these civvies to a defensible position and prepare for the storm that's about to hit us." "Hoorah!" his Marines chorused back, their voices filled with grim dedication. They knew many of them likely wouldn't be leaving this colony alive, but they would make damn sure the Norans paid a heavy price for every inch of ground and every human life. As the team moved out, herding the shell-shocked colonists to a nearby bunker complex, the first Noran drop pods began slamming into the colony's outskirts. Connor watched them fall, his grip tightening on his rifle. The real battle was about to begin. Connor's boots pounded on the permacrete as he and his Marines hustled the remaining colonists towards the waiting assault shuttle. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as a fresh wave of Noran soldiers stormed into the colony, having just beamed down from their ships in orbit. The aliens let out guttural war cries, their razor-sharp teeth bared as they charged towards the humans. "Covering fire!" Connor barked, dropping to one knee and sighting down his rifle. The weapon kicked against his shoulder as he sent a burst of hypersonic slugs screaming towards the advancing Noran. Beside him, Brian and the other Marines opened up as well, their weapons stitching deadly patterns across the enemy's ranks. Several Norans dropped, their armor perforated by the Marines' relentless fire, but more kept coming, hurdling the bodies of their fallen comrades. Connor cursed under his breath, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one home. They just needed to buy a little more time. In the skies above, the Dauntless shuddered as a plasma torpedo slammed into its forward shields. On the bridge, Captain Hayes gripped the arms of her command chair as the deck pitched beneath her feet. "Shields at 30%, the tactical officer shouted over the din of battle. "We can't take much more of this." Hayes gritted her teeth as she watched the Noran knife fighters swarming around her beleaguered ship like a pack of hyenas. "Concentrate fire on their lion ships," Hayes ordered, "and get our fighter wings back here to cover us." On the planet below, Connor watched with a surge of relief as the last of the colonists clambered aboard the assault shuttle. The ship's engines flared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris as it lifted off from the plaza. But just as the shuttle clawed for altitude, a plasma grenade arced through the air and detonated against its rear quarter. The ship lurched drunkenly, smoke pouring from its damaged engine. "Get those civilians out of here," Connor shouted over the comms. "We'll cover you." As the wounded shuttle limped away, Connor and his Marines hunkered down behind the shattered remnants of a stone fountain. Noran soldiers poured into the plaza, plasma rifles blazing. Connor popped up from cover, his rifle bucking in his hands as he put a burst into a charging alien. The Noran's head snapping back, AO spraying from its shattered skull. "Frag out," Brian yelled, lobbing a plasma grenade over the fountain. The explosive detonated in the midst of a group of Norscans, scattering their smoking bodies across the plaza. But more kept coming. Amidst an endless tide of snarling reptilian killers, Connor knew they were out of time. He keyed his comms, his voice ragged with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. "All units, this is Lieutenant Mitchell. Fall back to secondary defensive positions. We'll make our stand in the colony's central bunker complex." As the Marines began a fighting withdrawal, harried every step of the way by the relentless Noran, the space battle took a desperate turn. A plasma torpedo punched through the Dauntless' weakened shields and slammed into its warp drive. The ship shuddered violently, consoles exploding in showers of sparks across the bridge. "Warp drive is offline," the helmsman reported, his voice edged with panic. "We're dead in the water." Hayes pounded a fist on her armrest, her face a mask of commitment. She knew this was it. The Noran would tear her crippled ship apart, but she'd be damned if she'd let them have it easily. "All fighter wings, form up and cover us," she barked into the fleet comms. "Engineering, I need that warp drive back yesterday, and someone get me firing solutions on every spirit-damned Noran ship out there." As the crew scrambled to carry out her orders and the Dauntless guns hammered defiance at the encircling Noran, Hayes found herself thinking of Connor and his Marines down on the planet. She knew they'd fight to the last, just like her crew. But against these odds, suddenly the sensor officer's console lit up like a Christmas tree. He blinked in disbelief, hardly daring to hope. "Captain, new contact bearing 227 Mark 81. It's a fleet of human ships. They're hailing us." Hayes whirled in her chair as the bridge view screen flickered to life. She found herself staring at the weathered, scarred visage of Admiral Tran, the legendary commander of the UES Invincible. "Heard you could use some help, Captain," Tran said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Let's show these Noran bastards what happens when you piss off the human race." As Tran's words sank in, Hayes saw the massive shapes of human battleships and cruisers pouring out of the warp rift, their guns already blazing as they tore into the Noran's exposed flank. The enemy ships reeled under the sudden onslaught, their formation shattering as they scrambled to reorient to face this new threat. Hayes felt a fierce grin spread across her face. They had a fighting chance now. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes hard. "All ships, weapons free. Let's finish this." Connor's eyes widened as the Noran lunged at him, the alien's knife glinting in the harsh sunlight. He jerked to the side, the blade missing his throat by inches. The Noran snarled, its reptilian eyes blazing with hatred as it slashed again. Connor parried the blow with his armored forearm, the knife's edge skittering across the cracked composite plating. He drove his other fist into the Noran's gut, feeling the alien scales crack under the force of the blow. The Noran grunted but didn't go down, instead headbutting Connor with brutal force. Stars exploded across Connor's vision as he staggered back, his helmet's visor spiderwebbing from the impact. The Noran pressed its advantage, its knife darting in again and again, seeking the weak points in Connor's armor. Connor backpedaled, his boots scrambling for purchase on the loose gravel. He could feel blood trickling down his face from a cut above his eye, the coppery taste filling his mouth. His armor system screamed warning after warning at him. Power levels critical, structural integrity compromised, life support failing. In the skies above, the tide of battle had turned with the arrival of the Invincible and its fleet. The Noran ships, suddenly faced with a wall of human guns, broke and ran, their hulls pocked with glowing craters from the Dauntless' vengeful fire. But even as they fled, the aliens spat one last barrage of plasma torpedoes at the Dauntless. The ship's point defense grid lit up, bright lances of energy impaling the incoming warheads. Explosions blossomed in the void, the Dauntless armor shrugging off the plasma blasts, all but one. A single torpedo, its guidance system shattered by a near miss, corkscrewed drunkenly through the defensive fire and slammed into the Dauntless port side like the fist of an angry god. Armor plating shattered, atmosphere venting in a crystalline spray as the ship lurched under the impact. On the bridge, Captain Hayes clung to her command chair as the deck heaved beneath her feet. Damage alarms howled, the cries of the wounded filling the smoke-choked air. "Damage report," Hayes barked, her eyes fierce. "H breach on deck 7 to 12. The damage control officer shouted back, his face pale. "Emergency bulkheads are in place, but we've got crew trapped behind them." Hayes's heart sank. She knew what those bulkheads meant. An impenetrable barrier between the crew and safety, a cold equation that sacrificed the few to save the many. Every captain's nightmare. On the planet, Connor barely heard the chatter over the comms. His world narrowed down to the snarling Noran before him. The alien was weakening, green blood oozing from a dozen wounds, but it refused to fall. It came at him again, its knife seeking his throat. Connor caught the Noran's wrist, the two of them grappling for control of the blade. Suddenly, the ground beside them erupted in a geyser of dirt and flame. Connor's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he saw a flight of Raptor attack helicopters screaming over the battlefield, their rocket pods and Gauss cannons hammering the Noran positions. The aliens scattered, their formation disintegrating under the onslaught. Connor seized his chance, keying his comms with a shout. "This is Lieutenant Mitchell. I need an emergency beam out now." But even as he spoke, his eyes caught a flicker of movement. A wounded Noran, its armor smoking and shattered, rose from the rubble, a plasma launcher cradled in its arms. It aimed at the hovering raptors, its finger tightening on the trigger. Connor moved without thinking, releasing the Noran he was grappling with and launching himself at the other alien. He slammed into it just as it fired, the plasma grenade arcing harmlessly into the air to detonate in a blinding flash. The explosion threw Connor and the Noran back, sending them tumbling over the cliff's edge. They fell, the aliens' claws scrabbling at Connor's armor as they plummeted towards the jagged rocks below. Connor felt the bone-jarring impact as they hit the ground, his armor cracking like an eggshell, pain lancing through him, hot and sharp. Through blurry eyes, he saw the Noran soldier struggling to rise, a wicked-looking knife clutched in its fist. It lunged at him, its eyes burning with primal hate, the blade flashing down. Connor gritted his teeth as he caught the Noran's knife hand in his armored grip, servos whining with the strain. Pain lanced up his injured arm at the jarring impact, nearly making him lose his hold. The Noran hissed, its fetid breath washing over Connor's visor as it lunged forward, trying to bear him down with its sheer mass. They rolled across the rocky ground, a tangle of straining limbs and scraping armor plates. Connor's HUD flickered, damage alerts flashing red. In his peripheral vision, he could feel the Noran's claws scrabbling at his chest plate, seeking purchase, seeking to rip and tear. With a roar of effort, Connor heaved himself upward, forcing the Noran back. He pinned its knife hand to the ground, his other gauntlet closing around its throat. The alien thrashed beneath him, its eyes bulging with rage and hate. "Yield!" Connor snarled through clenched teeth. "It's over." The Noran spat a glob of viscous saliva, splattering across Connor's visor. "Never!" it rasped, its voice thick with loathing. "I will not submit to a human. I would rather die." For a moment, Connor tightened his grip, the servos in his gauntlet whirring with deadly potential. It would be so easy to crush, to end this here and now. But as he stared down at the Noran, its scales torn and leaking ichor, its hate-filled eyes still defiant, he couldn't do it. With a grunt, he raised his fist and brought it down on the alien's jaw with calculated force. The Noran went limp, its head lolling back, panting. Connor slumped back, his hand fumbling for the emergency beacon on his belt. He thumbed it on, a green light winking in the gloom. Extraction imminent. Now he just had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. High above, the void of space lit with the fires of dying ships, the Invincible and its mighty battle group tore into the Noran fleet. Gauss cannons and particle lances ripped through knife fighter hulls like they were made of paper. The aliens reeled under the onslaught, their formation shattering like glass. On the bridge of his crippled flagship, Commodore Kobe slammed a fist on his command throne, a snarl twisting his lips. Alarms blared, consoles sparking and flickering around him. He could see the human ships closing in on the console, their hulls filled with weapons eager to finish the kill. "This is not over," he hissed, his eyes burning with fanatic light. "We will have our revenge. The humans will pay for this insult." In blood, his claw stabbed down on a pulsing red button set into his armrest. A klaxon began to blare, a voice booming in guttural Noran. Self-destruct sequence initiated. All personnel to escape pods. Kobe remained where he was as his bridge crew fled, a cruel smile playing across his lips. The humans thought they had won. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. He watched the human ships grow larger on the screen, blazing with the reflected light of his dying fleet. Just a little closer. With a roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of space, Kobe's flagship exploded, a miniature sun blooming in the void. The blast wave caught the closest human ships, sending them tumbling away, hulls scorched and shields flickering. On the Dauntless bridge, Captain Hayes flinched as the light of the explosion washed over the viewports. Damage reports flooded in, the ship's computer cool and calm as it rattled off a litany of woe. Hull breaches, fires, Overloaded medbay. Offline warp drive. Hayes focused her mind, her gaze locked on the fading fury of Kobe's funeral pyre. The Noran was dead. But at what cost? How many more had he taken with him in his final spite? The comm crackled, a voice tight with pain and exhaustion breaking through the static. Captain Hayes, this is Lieutenant Mitchell. I've been recovered by a team, en route to the Dauntless now. Hayes let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Connor was alive, battered no doubt, but alive. It was more than many could say. Understood, Lieutenant, she replied, her voice rough. Report to Medbay immediately upon arrival. And Connor, good work down there. There was a pause, a hitch of breath that might have been a laugh or a groan. Thank you, sir, Mitchell responded. Out, Hayes ordered. She slumped back in her chair, her eyes closing for a brief moment. They had won. The colony was safe, the civilians evacuated, the Noran threat, at least for now, had been broken. But the cost? She shook herself, straightening her shoulders. There would be time for grief later, time to count the dead and mourn the lost. But now there was still work to be done. Helm, set a course for the nearest starbase, she ordered, her voice steady. Best possible speed. And get me a line to the Invincible. I need to speak with Admiral Tran. He had a feeling that this was nowhere near the end. The Noran had been beaten back, but not broken. They would regroup, rebuild, and return. And humanity had to be ready. But for now, for this moment, they could breathe, they could heal, they could look to the stars and know that once again, they had held the line. Once again, they had proven that when the galaxy pushed, humanity pushed back. And heaven help anything that stood in their way. Connor lay on the medical bed, the soft beeping of the monitors filling the room. The nanomachines coursed through his bloodstream, knitting bones and mending torn flesh. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the battle in his mind. The screams of the colonists, the sizzle of plasma bolts, the crunch of Noran bones under his armored fists. The knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Come in, he rasped, his throat still raw from shouting orders over the din of combat. Captain Hayes stepped into the room, her face lined with exhaustion. Lieutenant Mitchell, it's good to see you awake, she said. Connor struggled to sit up, wincing as his battered body protested. Thank you, sir. The colonists, did they all make it? Hayes nodded. Thanks to you and your team. You did a hell of a job down there, Connor. I've put you in for a commendation. Connor shook his head. I was just doing my duty, sir. We all were. Hayes pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. I just came from a briefing with Starfleet intelligence. They've been interrogating the Nor prisoner you captured. Connor's eyes narrowed. What did he say? That the attack on the colony was a test, Hayes explained. The Norcans wanted to see how our New Yorktown-class ships would perform in a real fight. They deliberately targeted the colony to lure us in. Connor's fists clenched, his palms squeezing firmly. They used those civilians as bait, sacrificed their own soldiers just to bloody our noses. Hayes sighed. It gets worse. The prisoner claims this was just the beginning, that the Noran High Command is planning more attacks like this. They want to bleed us dry, force us to overextend ourselves defending every frontier outpost and colony. Connor felt a cold knot form in his gut. So Epsilon said all those lives lost. It was for nothing. No, Hayes said firmly. We showed the Noran that we won't be pushed around, that we'll fight tooth and nail to protect our own. Kobe and his fleet paid the price for their arrogance. Connor looked down at his hands, remembering the feel of the Noran scale under his gauntlets, the hot spray of alien blood on his visor. How many more, though? How many more colonies will suffer before this is over? Hayes stood, placing a hand on Connor's shoulder. I don't know, but I do know that as long as we have soldiers like you, the Noran will never prevail. Get some rest, Lieutenant. The fight's not over yet. As Hayes left the room, Connor slumped back onto the bed, his mind racing. The Dauntless limped through space, the distant gleam of the starbase growing steadily larger in the viewports. Repair drones swarmed over the ship's hull, sparks flying as they labored to mend the battle scars. The starbase hung in the void like a glittering jewel, its spinning habitation ring glinting in the light of the system star. Shuttles flitted to and fro, offloading wounded and taking on supplies. As the Dauntless slid into its berth, a cheer went up from the station's crew, echoed by the rescued colonists waiting in the docking bay. Connor, limping slightly and supported by Brian, made his way down the boarding ramp to a hero's welcome. People surged forward to shake his hand, to clap him on the back, their faces alight with gratitude and admiration. But even as he basked in the warmth of their praise, Connor couldn't shake the chill that had settled in his bones. The Noran were still out there, plotting their next move. How long until another colony burned? How long until more innocents died? His dark musings were interrupted by a shout from the crowd. The Invincible! She's breaking orbit! Connor turned to see the mighty battleship pulling away from the station, her engines flaring blue. A murmur ran through the assembled throng, confusion and fear mingling in their voices. "What's happening?" Brian asked, his brow furrowed. Connor's mind focused as the realization hit him. They found another target. The Noran have hit another colony. God damn it! Brian swore softly. It never ends. Does it? Connor could only watch helplessly as the Invincible vanished into the depths of space, speeding toward yet another battlefield. The Dauntless, her wounds still fresh, could do nothing but wait and heal. And in that moment, Connor felt a weariness that no amount of rest could cure, a bitter frustration at his own helplessness, at the seeming futility of it all. They had won the battle, but the war stretched on, an endless treadmill of violence and suffering. He looked down at his hands, remembering the weight of his weapon, the recoil that had juddered up his arms as he cut down Noran after Noran. Was this his destiny? To fight and bleed and watch his comrades die, all for a peace that seemed forever out of reach? He had no answers, only the cold certainty that the fight would go on, that it must go on, for the sake of the colonists, for the sake of all humanity. No matter the cost, no matter the scars it left on his soul. He was a Marine, and he would do his duty even if it killed him. The medbay doors hissed open, and Connor looked up from his bed to see a trio of Starfleet engineers striding towards him, their faces etched with a mix of excitement and concern. The lead engineer, a tall, wiry man with a shock of graying hair, extended his hand. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm Dr. Sensen, Chief of Weapons Research. We need to talk." Connor sat up straighter, ignoring the twinge in his mending ribs. "What's this about, Doc?" Sensen glanced at his colleagues before speaking. "We've been analyzing the captured Noran tech, specifically their plasma rifles, and we found something disturbing." He tapped a command into his datapad, and a holographic schematic sprang to life above Connor's bed. It was a Noran plasma rifle, but there was something different about it. The plasma coils were larger, more intricately wound. "This is a new type of weapon, Lieutenant," Sensen explained. "It fires a plasma bolt with an oscillating frequency that allows it to slip right through our armor shielding, even the Wolverines." Connor felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the searing pain of the plasma bolt that had breached his own armor. My God, if they had these on Epsilon Ceti, every Marine in that colony would be dead. Sensen finished grimly. "We got lucky this time, but we might not be so lucky next time." Connor's fists clenched. "So what's the plan? How do we stop these things?" The engineer's face lit up with a fierce grin. "We're working on a countermeasure, a way to modulate our armor shields to block that oscillating frequency. But we need your help." Connor swung his legs off the bed, standing to face Sensen eye to eye. "What do you need me to do?" In the following weeks, Connor practically took up residence in the research labs, working closely with Sorensen's team. They ran numerous simulations, testing various shield modulations against the captured Noran weapons. Connor's combat expertise proved invaluable, aiding the engineers in understanding how the weapons might be deployed in actual combat scenarios. It was grueling work, with extended hours and numerous setbacks, but Connor pushed himself harder than ever before. He understood the stakes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the colonists who had perished on Epsilon Ceti, heard the screams of his Marines as plasma bolts tore through their armor like paper. Never again, he swore to himself, would such tragedy be allowed to happen. While Connor and the engineers raced to perfect the countermeasure, the war continued unabated. Reports flooded in of Noran attacks across the frontier, each one more audacious and brutal than the last. Despite the tireless efforts of the Invincible and its fleet, they found themselves overwhelmed, unable to respond adequately to every distress call. The Norans were now targeting civilian vessels, resulting in the deaths of thousands of innocents. In the halls of Starfleet Command, grim-faced admirals deliberated over strategies, knowing that this conflict had escalated into a fight for humanity's survival. The decision was made. The Norans had to be stopped once and for all. Starfleet would take the fight to the enemy's doorstep, to the Noran homeworld itself. As the orders came down and the fleet began to assemble, the Dauntless, its scars repaired and armor gleaming, assumed its place at the forefront. In the hangar bay, Connor stood before his Marines, a fierce determination burning in his eyes. "This is it, Marines," he declared, his voice resonating with barely contained fury. "This is what we've been fighting for. Out there is an enemy that wants nothing more than to see us all dead. They've hurt us, they've bled us, they think they can break us. But they're wrong." His hand rested on the stock of his Gore rifle, the weapon gleaming in the hangar lights. "We're the tip of the spear. We're the ones who will take the fight to the Noran's own soil. And we will make them pay for every life they've taken, every drop of human blood they've spilled." A roar of approval swept through the ranks, armored fists pounding against chest plates in a thunderous cacophony. Connor nodded, his own heart pounding with the same righteous fury. "Gear up and get to your pods. We drop in 30, and Marines, give them hell." As the Marines dispersed to their assault craft, Connor took a moment to stare out at the hangar bay's shimmering energy field, gazing at the stars beyond. Out there, the Noran homeworld waited, its defenses bristling with the instruments of war. It would be a battle unlike any he'd ever witnessed, a crucible that would test him and his Marines to their limits. But they would not falter, they could not, because this was more than just another battle. This was a reckoning, a chance to finally end the Noran reign of terror. As Connor stepped into his own assault pod, a grim sense of purpose settled over him like a shroud. "Come what may, I will see this through, for the fallen, for the innocent, for the future of humanity itself." The pod door sealed with a hiss, and Connor felt the familiar kick of the launch thrusters. Closing his eyes, he pictured the Noran homeworld growing larger in his mind's eye. It was time to finish this. The warp tunnel collapsed into a dazzling starfield as the human fleet emerged in the Noran home system. But there was no time to admire the view. Space lit up with angry red flashes of plasma fire as a massive swarm of Noran ships surged to meet them. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Captain Hayes leaned forward in her chair, eyes hard. "All ships, engage at will. Concentrate fire on their heaviest ships, and watch out for those plasma lances." The human fleet, 100 strong with the Yorktown-class cruisers at its core, met the Noran charge head-on. Particle beams and GS cannons flashed back and forth between the opposing lines, shields flaring and hulls buckling under the onslaught. In the Dauntless drop bay, Connor felt the deck shudder beneath his armored boots as the ship took a glancing hit. Around him, his Marines checked their weapons one last time, faces grim behind their visors. 30 seconds, the drop bay controller announced. "Stand by to deploy." "Chimed, it's time, Captain. We're ready to go." "Wish us luck," Connor radioed. "Give them hell, Lieutenant," Hayes replied, her voice tight. "We'll keep them off your back as long as we can." The drop bay doors yawned open, revealing the blue curve of the Noran homeworld. "Go, go, go!" Connor roared as the drop pods slammed down their launch rails, the brutal acceleration pressing him back into his crash couch. Plasma bolts streaked past the pod's tiny viewports as Noran point defenses bracketed them. The pods screamed down through the atmosphere, trailing tails of superheated plasma. With bone-jarring force, they slammed into the ground, kicking up plumes of dirt and pulverized rock. Connor was out of his harness and moving before the hatch had fully opened, his Gore rifle already spitting death at the Noran soldiers swarming to meet them. All around him, Marines poured out of their pods, forming up into fire teams. Teams and squads, plasma bolts sizzled overhead as the Noran opened up with crew-served weapons and fixed emplacements. "Move, move! Get to cover!" Connor bellowed, sprinting for a low ridgeline. His Marines followed, leapfrogging each other with covering fire. They hit the ridge and hunkered down, returning fire at the advancing Noran. The air crackled with the ozone tang of plasma and the electrical snap of GS rounds. "Sir," Corporal Jenna Chun called out, pointing to the sky. Connor followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Descending from orbit was a massive construct of metal and composites, dripping with gun turrets. Mounted on its underbelly was the biggest plasma cannon Connor had ever seen, its barrel glowing an angry red as it slowly traversed to point at the battling fleets above. Connor keyed his long-range comm, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Captain Hayes, are you seeing this? The Noran have some kind of super weapon in orbit." There was a burst of static, then Hayes' voice filled Connor's helmet, strained and harried. "We see it, Lieutenant. That thing's tearing through our ships easily. Analysis says a direct hit could even take out the Invincible." You've got to take it out. Connor swallowed hard, his mind racing. A frontal assault would be suicide, even with the new plasma countermeasures. They needed to get inside that station, take it apart from within, and for that, they needed a way in. His eyes fell on a damaged Noran shuttle, smoke rising from rents in its hull as it wallowed toward a landing zone a click to the east. A desperate plan began to form in Connor's mind. Captain, I have an idea, but I'm going to need a diversion, a big one. There was a moment of silence on the comm. Then Hayes spoke, her voice heavy with understanding. You'll have it, Lieutenant. Just make it count. Hayes out. Connor turned to his squad leaders, the men and women he trusted above all others. Chun, Sens, and Perry, you're with me. We're going to commandeer that shuttle and get aboard that station. The rest of you, dig in and give them hell. Buy us as much time as you can. There were no words of protest, no hesitation, just a chorus of, "Aye, sir," and the click of weapons being made ready. Connor nodded, pride and fear warring in his chest. Let's move out, Marines, and Godspeed to us all. Connor stood at the edge of the rubble-strewn plaza, his rifle held loosely at his side. Around him, his Marines were setting up a perimeter, securing key buildings and rounding up the last few Noran soldiers who had yet to surrender. But even as they went about their duties with professional efficiency, Connor could sense the unease that hung over them like a pall. He turned to survey the ruins of the Noran capital, his eyes tracing over the shattered remnants of once proud buildings and the blackened craters left by orbital bombardment. The streets were choked with debris and the twisted remains of vehicles, and the air was thick with the acrid tang of smoke and death. It was a scene that had become all too familiar to Connor over the long months of the war. But now, with the fighting finally over and the process of occupation beginning, he found himself confronted with the true cost of their victory. Everywhere he looked, he saw the signs of a people broken and beaten. Noran civilians huddled in makeshift shelters, their eyes hollow and haunted. Children picking through the rubble, searching for scraps of food or anything of value. And everywhere, the dead lay where they had fallen, their bodies left to rot in the sun. Connor felt a sudden surge of anger and frustration. What was the point of it all? What had they really achieved here beyond more death and destruction? He thought of the brave Marines who had fought and died under his command, and the countless Noran soldiers and civilians who had perished in the relentless onslaught of human weapons. Had there been another way? Could they have found a path to peace that didn't involve so much bloodshed? These were questions that Connor had grappled with before in the quiet moments between battles. But now, confronted with the grim reality of the occupation, they weighed on him more heavily than ever. He was jolted from his thoughts by the approach of Sergeant Perry, her armor still spattered with the blood of Noran insurgents. She saluted crisply, her face a mask of stoic professionalism. "Sir, we've secured the central district and set up checkpoints on all the major thoroughfares. But there's something you need to see." Connor frowned, gesturing for her to lead the way. They picked their way through the rubble-strewn streets, passing groups of wary Noran civilians and grim-faced Marines on patrol. Finally, they reached a makeshift hospital that had been set up in the shell of a bombed-out building. Inside, the stench of blood and decay was overpowering. Noran medics moved among the rows of wounded, their scales spattered with gore as they fought to save the lives of their people. But it was the patients themselves that caught Connor's eye. They were not soldiers, but civilians, women, children, the elderly. Their injuries were horrific, inflicted by shrapnel, blast waves, and collapsing buildings. Connor felt his gut clench as he took in the sheer scale of the suffering on display. "God damn it," he muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "This isn't right. These people aren't combatants. They didn't ask for any of this." Perry nodded grimly. "I know, sir, but this is the reality of occupation. We can't just pack up and leave now that the fighting's over. We have a responsibility to these people to help them rebuild and find a way forward." Connor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. He turned to leave, his mind already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. As they stepped back out into the ruined streets, Connor paused to survey the scene once more. The occupation was just beginning, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with peril. But he also knew that he couldn't turn his back on the Noran people, not after everything they had endured. He straightened his shoulders, his expression resolute with willpower. "Come on," he said to Perry. "We've got work to do." If you appreciated the story and wish to show your support, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Additionally, for each comment containing 88, I will heart every single one. Thank you for your time.